AnxietyCenter.com podcasts, where we talk about everything anxiety, as well as other medical, mental, behavioral, parenting, and nutritional health topics. Thank you for joining us. We hope you find today's podcast interesting and inspiring. Here are your hosts, Jim and Marilyn Folk.
Hi, I'm Jim Folk.
And I'm Marilyn Folk. We are the founders of AnxietyCenter.com and the hosts of AnxietyCenter.com podcasts.
Thanks again for joining us today. Welcome to episode 6 of AnxietyCenter.com podcasts. Today we're going to air part 2 of our interview with Brian Sellers, one of our recommended anxiety disorder therapists. If you missed part 1, you may want to go back and listen to episode 5. Here is part 2 of our conversation with Brian.
How about telling our listeners a little bit about your educational background?
Yeah. I'll go all the way back to my undergraduate, and it was in agriculture engineering technology, which is kind of an interesting curriculum to do what I'm doing today. But I will say that even that, the reason I wanted to share that is because even that was something that I wasn't a big risk taker. Certainly wouldn't do anything that was what I would consider unique. And where I grew up in farming country, anything outside of, especially associated with mental health, was a little bit quirky, a little bit strange. Okay, so you got to realize that, and again, it just wasn't real safe. And I wanted something that was safe, secure, that I knew, and that was something I knew, even though that really wasn't something I was really interested in. So, fast forward. Until 2003, 2004, I was stuck in a job and actually in sales that I just was not me in any way, shape, or form. I didn't enjoy it. It didn't fit my. It didn't really fit my values. It didn't fit my talents and abilities. And I began to kind of really search and found that I needed to be in a helping profession. And I went to, actually took a class at a local seminary that a professor taught who was a counselor in the area. And I took it not for credit, just took it to, determine whether or not this was something I wanted to do. I told my wife before I took it, and I took it. I think I sit in maybe 4 classes, and I said, "Yeah, this is absolutely what I'm called to be and what I'm called to do." And it didn't take long for me to do that. But that's one of the things that kind of started me on that journey. And not too long after that, I went to a little liberal arts school in Alabama called the University of Montevallo and got my graduate degree, master's degree in community agency counseling there. I was really affirmed on, I can still remember this, Marilyn, on our first meeting, the professor who was my advisor, we were going around and everybody was telling their undergraduate degree. Well, I was a little embarrassed because you had all these psych majors in there, and I thought, okay, this ought to be interesting. And so we went around the room and I said, I'm going to tell them that I'm an agriculture engineering technology degree. Okay. I said, my degree is in agriculture engineering. And some people kind of snickered and laughed, said, what led you here, And we opened the book, and the first person we came to was Carl Rogers, who was kind of the founder of counseling, if you will. Carl Rogers' undergraduate degree is in ag economics, so it didn't make me feel so unique anymore. But that's one of the things that I always struggled with, and we certainly talk about that a lot with our clients, is just that overly responsible self that was always focused on what everybody else was thinking about. So even in graduate school, it was very prevalent in my life that I wanted to please everybody, make sure everybody was happy. But I knew I was at home. I knew exactly that was the curriculum for me. And like I said, I always struggled in undergraduate academically, and in graduate school, absolutely loved it and was able to excel there. And so that was basically my academic education. Then after that, I actually went to work for a psychiatric hospital here locally where I live called Parkwood. And I worked with a little bit of everything there, but ended up kind of a unique setting. I worked in residential, adolescent residential. Also worked with the drug court in the county in which I live, adolescent drug court, I should say that. And also I worked with adolescent sex offenders. So it was really a unique education those first few years, and then my first year or two out of graduate school. I've experienced and been around a lot of different types of mental health disorder, all of which may have some elements of anxiety. However, most of the ones that I was seeing were, like I said, much more focused on addiction at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right.
So you've been with us for a while now, Brian.
Yeah, doesn't time flies?
It sure does, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how did you come to find us?
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting, kind of a unique process. I actually was praying, and I wanted to put this in here. I was praying. My wife had even had this is part of my story, so I always tell others about this. But I was praying, hey, I would love to, help others all around the world. My wife was traveling at the time, and so it was a real frustration. I was working at the local psychiatric hospital, and just, again, I didn't feel like that was my true calling of the population that I wanted to be with. And at the time, again, especially I had a friend of mine that owned a private practice here. He didn't. It was hard to specify anxiety, and to be honest with you, I didn't have a lot of confidence with helping those with anxiety at that time anyway. So one of the things I did is I literally told my wife one day. She still tells the story. She said, "What is it that you would like to do?" And I said, I would, I really would love to help those around the world, and I would like to stay at home and be able to do it. Now, I did not think about physically being able to stay at home, but not too long after that, I got to searching and found that Anxiety Center had some openings, and I sent my resume in, and the rest is kind of history. I had not even found Anxiety Center at that time, but it was certainly an answer to prayer for us, and has been. And I always when I tell my stories, tell my story to others, I always say not only did I find a career that I absolutely love and with a great group of people, but I also was able to really get to the core of my own problem, and Marilyn knows this because she worked with me that first year or so, is that I still, and I can remember Marilyn saying this, Brian, you still have some issues, and she was dead on right. I still had a lot of underlying, fears, specifically beliefs that were keeping me, I wouldn't say, again, I wasn't that overstimulated, so physically I was feeling okay. But I realized that it still was keeping me trapped in certain ways. And, there are people that try to control their condition all the time that say, I don't have an anxiety condition, but if you've lived in a real small world and it's keeping you from being everything you want to be, then, again, there probably is some underlying issues there, regardless of whether you noticed you're having the physical symptoms every day. And that's what was happening to me. I had limited myself in certain ways. And I think that that was, Anxiety Center was just, has been such a help to me personally, not only as a career and as a coach here, but also as, in my own full recovery. So.
Well, yeah. So you've been doing this for some time, and so what's the favorite part? What's your favorite part about being a coach?
Yeah, I think it's the people we get to work with.
Yeah.
I always joke it's the movers and shakers of society. It's some fun people. I've worked from everything from CEOs to stay-at-home moms to attorneys and in fact physicians, and I mean, you name it, we've seen it, and I've seen it as well. However, most of them are, like I said, we have a lot of similarities. They're extremely hardworking individuals. And so watching the recovery process is a really neat process for me. It starts out, I've been doing this for 7 years. Jim and Marilyn's you've been doing this a lot longer, and I think you would say the same thing. It's a neat process when you see someone who is dreadfully afraid. I just got another appointment request today, and you get that first call, and they think, well, I think I'm just gonna die from this. This condition is just taking my life over, and I don't know what I'm gonna do. What's gonna happen? You take a person like that to a person that's able to be through the process, and at the end of that process is a much more confident person, not only about understanding the anxiety condition, but just in general. Extremely confident in terms of being much more assertive in their life and taking control in good ways and learning to accept the things they can't control. But just watching that process is just really, really neat, and it never gets old. One of the things that I did tell Summer, my wife, when I was talking about starting a new profession in counseling, I said, I want to do something that when I get to be, kind of the age in the U.S., I think it's either 62 or 65 before you can draw Social Security in the U.S. But long story short, I don't want to sit and wait on retirement age. That's not something I want to do. I want to do something I can do for the rest of my life, and I really don't. I'm not focused on retirement. And she agreed, because she said, I do want to retire. And so I said, yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's what's neat is we, while we may, just like anyone, we like to have our breaks. I think the neat part of this is you get to watch that recovery process. You get to see people get their lives back. And I would argue get lives that they didn't have before. We always joke and say that when people come to us, they say, I just want my life back. And we say, well, we're not going to give it to you like it was. Because it just wasn't very healthy before, even though you thought it was. And that's the neat part is them coming back and saying, I just got a call last week from a client that I hadn't heard from in a year, and it was not a session, but he just wanted to call and thank me for just as he said, hanging with him through that process, because it's an up and down motion, but at the end of that, you get to see someone who is extremely confident and also is able to live a good, healthy life and a fulfilling life rather than feeling trapped. So.
Jim and I have been doing helping people with anxiety for a number of years, and it seems to us that anxiety seems to be more prevalent today than ever before. Have you noticed that, Brian?
Oh, absolutely.
Have you noticed an increase? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with the onset of the technology that we have today, the just fast-paced lifestyles that we have been taught to live, we're going to see more and more of it. There is a lot of fear out there today as a result of, and we're not demonizing these things, but the bottom line is, it is what it is. Social media, TV, news, and we actually use these things, obviously, to get Anxiety Center's word out. But at the same time, for those who don't have the skills that we teach, then they really struggle when they encounter all this that is around us. So, I would say now more than ever, we're seeing a real epidemic, if you would call it that, of anxiety. I know Jim always kind of keeps us updated on the latest figures. But what is it, like 1 in 3 we say has an anxiety condition. I think in North America, it's very prevalent in every social circle that I'm in. It doesn't take long. If I, for example, or in my church, if someone hears that I'm an anxiety counselor, automatically they generally, maybe not in front of everybody because it's embarrassing to many, but generally they will get around to asking me some questions and even talking about their own struggles. So it is extremely prevalent in our society, and like I said, we're probably going to see more of it because people have just not developed some of the skills that we need in order to keep ourselves, in order to make sure that we're not fueling that fire that comes as a result of, again, a lot of our active lifestyles, really pushing ourselves. In many terms, one of the things that I always teach my clients, and it's a value, but many of us don't have it initially, is balance in life. And so that begins to be a process, and sometimes that's changing others' beliefs in regards to those things. And so, and sometimes there's even, we always say we do things that work for us. And so often in our society, the harder you work, the more you get rewarded for it many times. And so we have a tendency to not put boundaries around those things. Jim talks a lot about boundaries. I discuss boundaries a lot. So that's kind of what we're beginning to see. We're beginning to see this onslaught of generations because of the technology, because of again our just the things that have kind of transpired over the years that have helped us to go faster and quicker, and that in the same token, it can be overload for many people, and that's kind of what we're seeing, and that's certainly what I've seen, and what we see quite often as I talk to my clients. Many of their fears are related to things that they have not necessarily experienced, but something they've seen on TV or on Facebook, and so understanding that some of the skills that we teach, such as our containment skills, are necessary, so that when we have this onslaught of information, that we're not what we would call emotionally trapping ourselves with that information. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to continue to see that until, like I said, because people have to develop these skills. So,
I have a two-part question for you. As you know, over the years, there's been a lot of talk about the causes of anxiety, being genetic, chemical, problem with the brain and all that. Since you help people overcome anxiety, what do you say is what causes people to become anxious?
Yeah, no doubt about it. For me, it's our unhealthy thoughts and behaviors that lead us down that road that generally starts at a very early age. Most of us learn quite often through modeling, through repetition, reinforcement, some of the ways in which we learn. And I've seen even the same thing with my own children. Some of the struggles I had in my early years, my son struggles some with that now. And I want to be transparent, because bottom line is none of us are perfect. In regards to that, you see that from a very early age, where some people would say, well, that there has to be a genetic link there. No, I don't think so at all. I think it's how I've reacted and responded in those real early years of life, that he learned some of that behavior in regards to perfectionism, and that's some of the things that I recognize now that he picked up on, that he basically developed that belief system from a very early age, that I need to I need to be perfect here. I don't need to say the wrong thing. I don't need to be wrong here. And so in regards to that, that's from my own experience, that's been one of the things that I've seen that's most prevalent, is that many people find or start reacting this way and start these behaviors from a very early age, and generally as a result of what they have learned. Mm-hmm. And that, I can point back to my own childhood, in addition to my son's, and he's much further along in learning how to contain those than I was at his age. And he says some things even now that, really make me proud in terms of where he is compared to where I was, which is awesome. We were coming home from a baseball game the other night, and he made a few errors, and he looked at me, and we were talking about, what he could have done differently. And he said, Dad, he said, he talked about it, and he said, you know what, I recognize that, I'm learning and I'm growing and I'm going to make mistakes. And it was one of those, okay, that was great. I don't know if I hope he believes that. He's heard me say it enough, but nice. He's getting it. And, whereas it was a learned behavior. I learned that from my mother. As much as I love my mother, I learned it from my father as much as I love my father. From a very early age, we pick up on those things and we start responding and reacting. I think we find that most of our characters built in those real early years, and our personality. And so often, we determine what works for us in those early years, whether it's true or not, whether it's or it's false. We still determine that, and I think that's what happened with me. And another evidence for me, Jim, is I don't know how often, and some people may say this is, this is I don't know. I think it's great evidence, but I used to work with. I had over the years. I've had quite a few twins, identical twins, and as I've worked with them, occasionally, as twins may do, you have to meet the other twin. And I've only worked with, in any of those cases, I've only worked with one of the twins. In one situation specifically, the client asked me to meet with his twin, and so I thought, while we're doing this, let's just do some of our assessments. And I worked with him and did some of the assessments. What I found is his fears and his beliefs were really different than his brothers. And they had done everything together. They, looked alike, talked alike, act alike, were in business together. Live right next door to each other. But bottom line is extremely different in the way they had responded and reacted throughout their childhood. And so I am the first to say that I've seen firsthand, even in my own life, that it was a learned behavior from very early age. That the great thing is that we can, as you've said so often, we can learn a new behavior. And I've been the recipient of that, and so many others are as well.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, absolutely. And here's part two then. A lot of people, when they develop anxious behaviors, they get their symptoms and they remain stuck for years. So what are some of the common reasons why people don't overcome anxiety? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think, they typically will remain stuck. So often it starts even with our belief system. We, such as myself, I always focused on, I had quite a few false beliefs. One of them that sticks out for me is that I felt like this was just the way I am. I'm just, quote, a fearful person. Okay. Yeah. I was afraid my entire life. So why, specifically, the ages that I can remember well, from 10 on up, there was a lot of fear there. And there was some fear before that. Like I said, I didn't feel as many physical symptoms until my teen years, but there was always that fear there. So for someone like me, I derived a belief system that this was just who I was. And as a result, I was just going to stay there. And if you would have told me, even in my early 20s, hey, you can overcome some of those fears, all of those fears. You can allow yourself to do things that you wouldn't want to do. I'll give you an example, and this is kind of a lighthearted example, but I was dreadfully afraid of amusement parks, and I used to hate to go to amusement park. Well, what 18-year-old or 17-year-old do you know that hates amusement parks? So it made me feel really awkward and unique. But I used to just say, well, I'm just a control freak, and I don't like to, ride things that I just am not in control of. And I would say those kinds of things, but the truth was, underneath that, I just felt stuck and felt trapped, and that was just, as far as I was concerned, that's just Brian. That's just who I was. And so that belief system is what kept me stuck until I began to recognize that wasn't who I was. That was a choice I was making to react in fear. That I didn't have to, respond that way. That I had some skills or learned some skills. But I would say the primary problem for me was my beliefs, and I think for so many others, that's what keeps them stuck. Is those same old beliefs that they've been telling themselves, those same old messages that have just kept them stuck for many years, and that I think is one of the primary problems. We do get into secondary stuff where people aren't willing to make some of the necessary changes. But for the most part, I find that most of my clients have been pretty willing to make those changes. But I think the biggest struggle still is beliefs. I think the beliefs are what keeps us from being able to allow ourselves to change, which keeps us stuck. It keeps us in a small world. And as a result of that, we continue to produce stress hormones, which continue to stimulate our body. So I think that's the primary problem for most people.
When we were having our Skype live group last time when Stacy joined us, we had a conversation similar. And, a lot of people think that level 1 recovery is, enough. But Stacy was saying that level 2 recovery is where all the work is to ensure lasting success. Absolutely.
Absolutely. We have to make that next step and go to that point. And that's a great point. Most people, the idea is just let me just make the symptoms go away and get me back into doing what I was doing before. When the truth is that there needs to be a lot of changes there, because what we were doing before is what led us down this road. And so we want to make sure that we're getting into level 2 and really addressing the core beliefs that have kept us trapped for so long. And that's where the freedom has come from for me. And my wife will be the first person to tell you that she married me 16 years ago now, and I'm a much more confident person today than I was 16 years ago. And it hadn't just been, you don't get there just by age. I think it's the skills that have allowed me to get to this point. And, and understanding that I've had to change a lot of my beliefs over the years that were just absolutely false. And so they kept me stuck. And it's a really neat process. But it's hard for some to allow themselves to get into that stage 2. There's some reasons for that. A lot of us don't like to look at our background. We don't like to to really look at ourselves in that way, but it really is where the core of the work goes on, no doubt.
Yeah, I know in the conversation one fellow was saying, and we probably hear this a lot, at least I certainly did, is people say, well, if I didn't have my symptoms, I wouldn't be anxious.
Wow.
Right?
I've heard that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All my stress is coming from my symptoms. And then Stacey made a good point in saying, wow, that's because your belief system is causing the symptoms, and you're not going to get rid of the symptoms and change, until you change your, beliefs and behaviors. It's kind of trying to put the cart before the horse. And it's, I know a lot of people have difficulty making that connection, but it's so true. We see it so often, hey?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. We chase our tail, so to speak. It's, but yeah, absolutely. The symptoms are nothing more than just, an alarm for us to recognize, hey, you're trapping yourself emotionally, physically in some way. And you got to address that. You got to address that underlying cause.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah, you bet, yeah. This ends part 2 of our conversation with Brian. We hope you join us next time for part 3.
So until next time, thanks again for joining us today. We wish you every success in your recovery efforts.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.